Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I would like to remember former world champion Vasily Smyslov, who sadly passed away a few days ago. I looked at one of his favorite books where he analyzed his favorite games from the early part of his career, and I picked a game I liked that I think greatly represents his style, the simplicity, the logic, the harmony that was so much typical of his play. Here is how the game started. c4, e5 starts out as an English opening but quickly gets transposed to a d4 opening. d6, knight f3. And in this position, black played a bit passive, playing c6. More typical would be to play knight f6 or even f5. He responded with d4. Now black may protect the pawn on e5 by playing knight d7 or trade on d4, which wouldn't look very attractive because it would give up the tension too quickly in the middle of the board. Smyslov's opponent, Federer, responded by playing queen c7 and protecting the pawn. However, the queen is not so ideally placed on c7. Here white can choose to develop the bishop on f1, either as Smyslov did, or of course simply play e4 and develop the bishop the other way. In either case, white has a pleasant slight advantage because of their space advantage especially. The game continued with g3, knight f6, and bishop g2. Now in this moment, black needs to make a serious decision which way to go with the bishop from f8. I think, and I agree with Smyslov, who wrote in his comments, that it was a better, more active choice for black to play g6 followed by bishop to g7. After g6, if white would like to play b3 with the idea that after bishop g7 to take, and try to prevent black from castling with bishop a3, black probably wouldn't get to that, but instead of playing bishop g7 right here, black may have the option to instead play e4 all of a sudden, and then follow it up by playing d5, connecting the pawns. Let's go back to the game. Therefore, if black would have chosen g6, white's best option is simply to castle. Now, if black would do the same thing, black would be too much behind in development, and white should and could immediately open up the position with f3, with a very dangerous position for black. As you can see, black is totally undeveloped. For example, if takes, now going after black's knight, and bishop g7, white can play really aggressively and immediately sacrifice with the rook f6, followed by knight e5, which is a fork attacking black's queen and bishop. Queen needs to move to protect the bishop, and then knight e4. Everything comes as a clockwork, and the bishop needs to move again. And now bishop f4. Of course, the knight on d5 is indirectly protected because of the discovery with knight d6 check. Now white threatens to fork on c7 or trap the rook if black would castle. So knight a6 tries to protect against that. And now check, queen a4, bishop d7, queen a3 puts black in a pretty much hopeless position. Let's go back again. Here we go. Well, the game went in a completely different direction, and of course the line we looked at briefly after g6 and castle Black is not forced to play e4, but can and should play bishop to g7 instead and kind of play normal. Here, White's normal common move would be to play e4, although White has a more ambitious approach as well to play c5. By the way, when your opponent kind of wastes a lot of time and doesn't develop the most efficient way, it's always a red flag to look out for opportunities to punish your opponent. And c5 is typical for such scenarios. Here the idea would be that after pawn takes, White would take in the other direction on e5, attacking Black's knight, and then after knight g4, bishop f4, and followed with knight e4. White obviously gains the pawn back and has some advantage. Naturally, all of this is not forced, and White can keep a solid advantage also just playing in this position, e4. Getting back to the game, Black continued with bishop to e7. And White castled, and so did Black. And now White is ready to play e4. A very typical setup for White. For Black, not so much so. Black typically would have the bishop on g7 in similar positions, and the knight on d7 by now. According to Smyslov, Black here was best off to play bishop to g4 and exchange that bishop that oftentimes becomes trouble, doesn't find its place in such and similar structures. Black, on the other hand, chose to play a5, which I have to say is a quite typical move for similar situations, but Smyslov clearly feels that it's out of place in this case. Also, it allows for White to conveniently play h3, which no longer allows the Black bishop to appear on g4 and pin the knight, and also prepares the natural development of White's dark squared bishop to e3, preventing any kind of harassment of the Black knight on g4. Black here played knight a6, which again didn't gain Smyslov's approval. He would have preferred knight b to d7. And came bishop e3, developing rook e8, a very natural move. And White simply positioned his rook for the future to the c file. Here, Smyslov's recommendation was to play bishop f8 and kind of keep the tension in the center. Instead, Black played knight to d7, which Smyslov calls decentralization. Now White played kind of an interesting move, moving the queen to e2. At first, it seems that it's out of place, since the Black rook is already on that same file. Of course, we can tell that there are a good number of pieces in between the White queen and the Black rook. I'm almost thinking that it's a provocation. White is hoping for Black to trade on d4. It may be a psychological move to that effect. Black played bishop f8 finally, and White responded with rook f to d1. White has completed development, and that is a strong contrast with Black's position. Black kind of has difficulty finding a reasonable move and decided to trade on d4. And Smyslov welcomed that news. He comments in his book that it was better to relocate the bishop with g6 and then bishop to g7. The trade came, ed4, and the knight captured back. Well, what can we tell about this position? On one hand, White has comfortable space advantage. Black has hardly crossed the 6th rank except one little side pawn on a5. In the meantime, white has excellent control of the center. White has several pawns and pieces on the fourth rank, and black has a weakness on d6. And that's one of the key problems in black's position, that because the c pawn has already moved, it can no longer be protected by another pawn. According to Smyslov's analysis, it was better in this position to start centralizing the knight from a6. Black's choice, moving the other knight to c5, keeps the knight on a6 long term, and obviously that's not a great choice. But yet, the question in such situations is how to eventually break through and win the game. And pay attention how Smyslov slowly but surely improves his position. The next move was King h2, which is a typical move for such situations, especially when white is planning to play eventually f4. Black responded with bishop d7, finally connecting the rooks on the back rank. And here it may be somewhat a matter of taste. I would have strongly considered trying to play f4 and advance with my pawns. But Smyslov had a different plan in mind, which actually worked out very well. He played queen f3, which in itself is a very natural move because it moves out from any potential pin along the e-file. Also, white is preparing knight to f5, and then if black would capture that, white would not need to double up the pawns but could recapture with the queen. Black responded by playing a4. And as planned, knight f5. White is trying to combine the attack, pressuring the d6 pawn, and also looking to the other side, attack black's king. The majority of the black pieces are isolated on the queen side of the board, so therefore an attack on the king side can be very effective. Here black continued with an awkward move, moving the rook out to e6. Smyslov recommends as an improvement instead to play bishop e6, targeting the c4 pawn, and then simply playing rook a to d8, centralizing the rook. The game continued with rook e6. And now white played queen f4, putting further pressure on that d6 pawn. And here black made another awkward move, and the recommendation to improve here is to play rook d8, followed by then bishop to c8, so the d6 pawn could be better defended. Black responded with rook f6, creating a pin over the white knight. I have to say that a rook very rarely belongs in front of the pawns in the middle game in a square like f6. An experienced eye can tell that this is an awfully awkward position for a rook. And typically, when a place doesn't look good for a piece, it very rarely is. The rook can get into various trouble, including getting trapped. I like white's next move, which was playing g4. I always find it curious when it is a good choice to open up in front of our own king, like in a situation like this. Obviously, when the kings are castled on opposite sides, for example, in many Sicilians, where white would choose to castle on the queen side versus black castling on the king side, playing g4 is something very natural and very typical. But in situations when both sides are castling on the king side, it is always an exception to the rule. With this move, on one hand, white is potentially creating an attack on the king side with the pawns, but more importantly, it is supporting the knight on f5, as well as clears the g3 square for white's queen. Black responded by playing rook e8, a natural move, and white, as planned, played queen g3. On one hand, getting out of the pin, and on the other hand, preparing to play f4. Three of the black pieces are busy guarding the pawn on d6. Black played h6 for now. And now white is ready to double up the rooks on the d file, rook d2. As you can tell, white is playing very naturally, simply to the point. There is a target and white is simply aiming at it. Black responded with bishop c8 and white doubled up the rooks. At any point, if black would capture the white knight, the plan is to capture back with the g-pawn to open up the g-file and also kind of trap the rook on f6. The game itself continued with black playing queen a5. One of the things that is so typical for Smyslov's games is that he prevents the opponent's counterplay. He was definitely a master at that. In this position, for example, he had the option to immediately capture the pawn on d6, but decided to not yet do it, in view that after trades on d6, black would get some counterplay by playing queen b4 with a double attack on two white pawns, on b2 and c4. White continued with bishop f4 instead. White wants to capture that pawn under his own conditions. Right now, if queen b4, Smyslov's plan was to take on d6. Now, if queen c4, then e5, rook g6, and knight h4. And black is in serious trouble because the rook is pretty much trapped, as if rook e6, even worse, the queen gets trapped. After bishop f4, black decided to capture the knight. And as we said, the plan is to recapture with the g-pawn. Now came queen b4, attacking the pawn, and this is perhaps the only moment of the game where white made an inaccuracy and immediately captured the pawn on d6. After the game, in his analysis, Smyslov considered bishop e3 an even superior move and then trapping the rook. Instead, he traded on d6, rook takes, bishop takes, and rook takes. Of course, things look pretty good for white here as well, because now if queen takes on c4, the pawn on h6 would be hanging. Black moved out of the pin, making sure that pawn stays, and now white's e-pawn marching up is really dangerous. Came queen c4, and here white chose a very impressive, elegant move, although the simpler e6 seems even better. Rook g6. It's hard to pass on a move like this. Of course, if pawn takes rook, queen takes, and then the rook on e8 is hanging. Black was forced into defense with rook g8, and now rook g4, putting the rook in a safe place with a tempo. Queen d3, and now came bishop e4. And this is where black made a mistake by not exchanging the queens, even though the endgame arising after that gives a clear advantage for white, but it was certainly a much better defense than what black did, keeping the queens on the board. Now, indeed, the e-pawn advanced. Trade, which was a discovered check, black captured, and came queen b2. And now queen f4. The attack is very obvious, the black king is in trouble, and in addition, the e-pawn is extremely dangerous. Knight b4, e7. The pawn just keep marching up. Here, if black would respond with knight e5, the plan is to play queen f5, king h8, now knight d6 is good, or the more elegant knight g5, which threatens to checkmate, and if pawn takes, checkmate in 2, in a very nice way. And checkmate with queen h5. Very nice. Going back to the game, Black now played knight d3, and then after knight f6, Black resigned. If queen takes, White just exchange queens, then rooks, and promotes the e-pawn, and if king goes to h8, then an elegant checkmate in 2 after queen h6. Very nice. A very nice and instructive game on how to play with these type of pawn structures that's very typical for the King's Indian. But even though this wasn't the King's Indian, it was the same pawn structures and very similar motifs played an important role. And now let's see the jewel of the week. Here we go. In this endgame composed by Kubel in 1937, it is White's move. As usual, I suggest you take your time and try to figure out the solution on your own. The correct solution here is simply advancing the pawn. And here comes the catch. After king g6, pawn takes, king g8, bishop g7. It seems that Black holds off White's f-pawn. If it promotes, bishop takes, and then the Black king simply marches up on the g-file, capturing White's last pawn, and it's game over. However, amazingly, White can win the game simply by putting Black in Zugzwang, and Black can resign. A simple but beautiful endgame. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed one of Smyslov's favorite games and learned from it on how to play in that so typical pawn structure. Be back next week for some more chess ideas.